Prince William had finally made the decision that would bring Princess Diana back into the heart of Windsor, and Princess Anne was standing beside him when it happened. What appeared to be the quiet restoration of a long-forgotten portrait immediately became something far more personal, because for William, this was never simply about a painting. It was about his mother, the memory he had carried since childhood, and a place he believed she had always deserved. But why did Anne become the one person willing to help him make it permanent? Before we uncover what happened behind closed doors, make sure you are subscribed. Because this story is not simply about Diana's portrait, it is about who controls her legacy. But to understand why William would choose this particular moment and why Anne would stand beside him, we have to return to the wound neither of them ever truly discussed. The portrait was finally back. Inside Windsor Castle, where generations of royal history had been preserved in carefully chosen rooms and ceremonial spaces, Princess Diana's image had suddenly taken on a significance far greater than anyone outside the palace could have understood. It was not simply a painting being moved from one wall to another. It was a statement about memory, belonging, and the woman whose presence had never truly disappeared from the royal family. Prince William had made his position clear. Diana deserved to be remembered. And Princess Anne was there. That detail mattered. Anne was not known for emotional displays or dramatic gestures. She had spent her entire life treating royal duty as something that required discipline, restraint, and an almost stubborn commitment to tradition. Yet, on this occasion, she was standing beside William as Diana's portrait was brought back into a place of prominence. For William, the moment carried the weight of everything he had been unable to change as a child. He could not change what happened to his parents. He could not protect his mother from the collapse of her marriage. He could not stop the world from watching her private suffering become public spectacle. And he certainly could not change the night Diana died. But there was one thing he could change: how the institution remembered her. That was why the portrait mattered. For years, Diana had remained one of the most powerful figures in the emotional memory of Britain, even after her death. Millions remembered her compassion, her public work, her ability to connect with people who had never before felt close to the monarchy. Yet inside the institution itself, her place was far more complicated. A portrait could remain in storage. A room could be closed. A name could become less prominent. A memory could slowly be pushed away from the center of public attention. But William had reached a point where he no longer believed that had to continue. And Anne understood something about that decision that perhaps very few people could. She understood the monarchy from the inside. She knew that symbols mattered. She knew that where a portrait hung, who stood beside whom, and which names were given prominence, could communicate something more powerful than a speech. That was why her involvement transformed the meaning of William's decision. This was no longer simply a grieving son trying to honor his mother. It had become something much larger. A royal institution was being asked to acknowledge a part of its own history that could never truly be erased. And somewhere within that decision was another question, one that would eventually become impossible for the family to avoid. If Diana's memory was being restored, what did that mean for the woman who had spent decades building her own place within the same institution? Camilla did not yet know the full significance of what was happening, but William did. Anne did. And Charles was about to discover that sometimes the most consequential decisions inside the monarchy are not announced with ceremony. They begin quietly, behind closed doors, and only become visible when it is already too late to stop them. For William, the portrait could never be separated from the woman behind it. Long before he became the Prince of Wales, before he understood the machinery of the monarchy, William was simply a son trying to understand why his family had fallen apart. The world saw Diana as a global figure. William saw something much more private. He saw his mother. He remembered her voice, her affection, her ability to make ordinary moments feel important. And he also remembered the tension that had surrounded his parents for years. As a child, he had been exposed to a family crisis that no child should ever have been expected to understand. Then Diana died. William was still a teenager when he walked behind his mother's coffin through the streets of London. Millions watched him, but almost nobody could know what was happening inside his mind. He could not stop. He could not speak freely. He could not grieve like an ordinary son. The world needed the future king to remain composed, even while he was saying goodbye to his mother. That image remained with him. And over the years, something changed. The grief became quieter. The anger became more controlled. The boy who had once been unable to influence anything gradually became a man who understood exactly how the institution around him worked. That distinction would eventually become crucial. William did not want to spend his life publicly fighting about Diana. He understood that doing so could make her memory appear trapped in the same conflict that had defined the final years of her marriage. Instead, he learned to wait. Princess Anne understood waiting better than almost anyone. She had spent decades inside the monarchy watching personalities rise and fall while the institution itself continued. She knew that personal feelings could be powerful, but she also knew that lasting change required something more. It required legitimacy. That was what made Anne's involvement so significant. She did not need to make a dramatic speech about Diana. She did not need to publicly attack Camilla. She did not need to explain every emotion she carried. Her presence beside William said something far more subtle. She was willing to acknowledge Diana's place in the family's history, and that created an uncomfortable question for everyone else. What happens when the institution itself begins to restore the memory of someone whose presence had once been deeply complicated by the people still living inside it? For Camilla, the answer was particularly difficult. Her entire public life within the monarchy had required her to exist alongside Diana's enormous legacy. Whatever personal history existed between them, Diana remained impossible to compete with in the public imagination. She was gone, yet she continued to occupy an extraordinary emotional space. William understood that better than anyone, but there was another reason Anne's involvement mattered. She knew William was not simply trying to reopen an old wound. He was trying to close one. There is a profound difference between revenge and remembrance. Revenge requires an enemy. Remembrance requires a place. And William had begun to believe that his mother had never been given the place she deserved. Anne appeared to agree. But neither of them had reached this conclusion in isolation. Something had happened behind closed doors that transformed William's feelings from private grief into a decision he was finally prepared to act upon. And once that moment is understood, the entire portrait story begins to look very different. Because William was not simply asking Anne to help him remember Diana, he was asking her whether the monarchy itself was finally ready to acknowledge her. The conversation began with a question William had carried for years. If Diana could no longer speak for herself, who would make sure she was remembered properly? It was not a question William asked publicly. There was no announcement, no statement from Kensington Palace, and no carefully prepared explanation for the press. It was simply a private conversation between a son and an aunt who understood the monarchy from the inside. Princess Anne listened. William had already spent years learning how the institution worked. He understood that emotion alone could not change the way royal history was preserved. If he acted only as Diana's son, his decision could be dismissed as personal. But if he acted within the rules of the institution, the meaning became very different. Anne recognized the distinction immediately. She reportedly challenged him on the most important question of all. Was he trying to honor his mother? Or was he trying to punish Camilla? William's answer would determine everything. Because if this was revenge, then the portrait was simply another weapon in a family conflict that had lasted for decades. But if this was remembrance, then William was doing something far more difficult. He was asking the monarchy to acknowledge Diana without turning her memory into another battle. That was the path he chose. He did not need to remove anyone. He did not need to humiliate anyone. He did not need to make a public accusation. He needed only to establish that Diana had a legitimate place within the history of the institution she had once represented. And that required preparation. William began looking closely at how royal portraits were handled, how collections were preserved, how ceremonial spaces were managed, and how decisions involving royal heritage could be carried out without becoming a personal confrontation. The more carefully he studied the process, the clearer something became. The monarchy had rules, and those rules could work both ways. For years, William had been the child who had no control over what happened around him. Now he was approaching a position where he could influence what happened next. That was the hidden transformation at the heart of the story. He was no longer asking his father to recognize his mother's importance. He was preparing to make that recognition part of the institution itself. Anne understood exactly what that meant. She knew that once a decision became institutional rather than emotional, reversing it would become much harder. That was why her involvement mattered. She was not simply supporting William as a grieving nephew. She was helping him navigate the very system that had shaped their family for generations. And suddenly, the portrait represented something much larger than Diana herself. It represented the difference between being remembered privately and being recognized publicly. For William, that distinction was enormous. Because he had watched his mother's life become a global story while her place inside her own family remained painfully complicated, he could not rewrite her marriage. He could not rewrite her final years. He could not rewrite the night she died. But he could decide that her absence would no longer determine how she was remembered. That was the moment the idea became more than an emotional wish. It became a plan. And yet, there was still one obstacle William could not simply overcome through preparation: his father. Because before Diana could return to the heart of Windsor, William would have to sit across from King Charles and make the case that this was not an act against Camilla. It was an act for Diana. And what Charles said in that private room would determine whether the plan moved forward at all. The meeting between William and his father was never going to be an ordinary conversation. There were no cameras, no advisors standing behind them, no journalists waiting outside the door for a reaction. Just a father and his eldest son, facing a decision that carried the weight of their family's most painful history. William did not enter the room to attack Camilla. That would have made everything easier to dismiss. Instead, he spoke about Diana. He explained why he believed her memory deserved a more visible place within the institution, and why he no longer wanted her legacy to exist only through public nostalgia and private family memories. Charles listened. For a man who had spent decades living with the consequences of his first marriage, the conversation could not have been easy. He understood what Diana meant to William. He also understood what Diana meant to the public. And he knew that any decision involving her could inevitably be interpreted through the complicated history between Diana, Camilla, and himself. The temptation would have been to treat the entire matter as another chapter in an old family dispute. William refused to let it become that. He kept bringing the conversation back to one principle. His mother deserved to be remembered for who she was, not simply for what happened to her marriage. That distinction placed Charles in an uncomfortable position. If he rejected the idea, he risked appearing to reject Diana herself. If he accepted it, he would be acknowledging that her place within the monarchy's historical memory remained significant even decades after her death. And there was another complication: Camilla. Charles knew that any decision involving Diana's prominence could be deeply uncomfortable for his wife. But William was not asking his father to choose between the two women, at least not directly. He was asking him whether the monarchy could make room for the truth of its own history. That was a much harder question to answer. Charles reportedly asked about the timing. Why now? Why make this decision at this particular moment? William's answer was calm. Because waiting any longer would not change the past. It would only allow the distance from Diana to grow. The conversation became quieter after that. There was no dramatic confrontation, no raised voice, no final accusation. The tension came from what neither man needed to say. William knew his father had spent years trying to build a stable future with Camilla. Charles knew his son had spent those same years carrying memories of his mother that could never simply be put aside. Eventually, William made the central point unmistakable. This was not about taking something away from Camilla. It was about giving something back to Diana. And that left Charles with a choice. He could object. He could delay the process. Or he could allow his son to move forward. Princess Anne's position made the decision even more significant. She understood the institutional side of what William was proposing and knew that if the process followed established procedures, it would be difficult to portray the result as a personal act of revenge. Charles did not suddenly erase the past. He did not pretend the family's wounds had disappeared. But he also did not stop William. That silence became its own answer. William left the meeting knowing that the most important barrier had been removed, but he also knew something else. Once the decision entered the machinery of the monarchy, it would no longer belong entirely to the family. The institution itself would take over, and when that machinery began moving, stopping it would become much harder than starting it. Once Charles chose not to stop William, the story entered a completely different phase. Until that moment, everything had been personal. A son remembering his mother, a father confronting an uncomfortable part of his past, an aunt deciding whether to support her nephew. But now the institution itself had to become involved. And the institution did not operate on emotion. It operated on procedure. Inside the palace, decisions involving royal collections, ceremonial spaces, official portraits, and historical presentation could not simply be made because one member of the family wanted them. There were curators. There were officials. There were records to examine and protocols to follow. There were questions about placement, preservation, security, access, and precedent. William understood this. That was why he had been so careful. He did not want Diana's return to look like an impulsive gesture made in anger. He wanted it to become something that could stand on its own. Princess Anne understood the importance of that distinction better than almost anyone. Her entire public life had been shaped by the discipline of the monarchy. She knew that institutions survive because decisions are eventually separated from the personalities who make them. That was precisely what William needed. The plan moved quietly. There was no dramatic announcement. No public confrontation, no warning that something significant was about to happen. Instead, palace staff began examining what was required. The portrait itself became an object of careful attention. Its condition had to be assessed. Its history had to be established. Its placement had to make sense within the surrounding collection. And the room itself had to be prepared. Every small procedural step had a larger meaning. The more carefully the process was completed, the harder it would become for anyone to dismiss the final result as a private act of revenge. This was the first major turning point. William was no longer simply expressing an opinion about his mother. He was using the structure of the monarchy to give that opinion permanence. And Anne's presence made the move even harder to interpret as a personal rebellion. She was part of the old institution. William represented its future. Diana represented the emotional memory that connected both generations. Together, they created an unusual alliance. But there was something else happening beneath the surface. The portrait was not really the end goal. It was the first visible symbol of a much larger reconsideration of Diana's place within the royal narrative. Her name could be spoken more openly. Her charitable legacy could be remembered without embarrassment. Her connection to the public could be treated as part of modern royal history rather than an uncomfortable chapter that needed to be approached carefully. And that changed the meaning of everything William was doing. The question was no longer simply whether Diana deserved a portrait. The deeper question was whether the monarchy was prepared to acknowledge how important she had remained after her death. That was a question with consequences far beyond one room at Windsor. Because if Diana's memory was being restored, then the balance of the royal family's historical narrative was beginning to shift, and Camilla would eventually have to confront what that meant. By then, however, the process was already too far advanced. The machinery had begun moving. Orders did not need to be dramatic. Meetings did not need to be announced. And nobody needed to declare victory. The institution was doing what institutions do best. It was turning a private decision into an official reality. But the moment that reality became visible, the emotional consequences would be impossible to control. And the person most affected by that transformation had not yet seen what was waiting for her inside Windsor. By the time Camilla discovered what had happened, the decision was no longer a private discussion. It was reality. The portrait had been restored. Diana's face was once again visible within the royal environment, no longer hidden away from view. And for Camilla, the significance was impossible to miss. This was not simply a painting being placed on a wall. It was Diana's return to a space from which her memory had, in effect, been absent. Camilla's reaction was immediate. She wanted answers. Who had authorized it? Why had she not been told? Who had been involved? And most importantly, could it be reversed? But the response from the institution was not what she expected. There was no emergency removal. No sudden order to take the portrait away. No frantic attempt to undo what William and Anne had put into motion. Instead, the machinery of the monarchy continued exactly as it had been designed to continue. Quietly, methodically, without emotion. That was perhaps the most unsettling part. For years, Camilla had occupied an increasingly secure position within the royal family. Her marriage to Charles had eventually been accepted by the institution and, over time, by much of the public. But now she was confronted with something that could not be solved through status. Diana was not being brought back as a rival. She was being brought back as history. And history could not simply be ordered out of the room. Camilla could object to the timing. She could question the decision. She could express discomfort. But if the proper institutional process had been followed, her personal feelings could not automatically reverse it. That was the moment the balance changed. William had not challenged Camilla by attacking her. He had challenged the idea that Diana's memory had to remain secondary in order for Camilla's position to feel secure. That distinction mattered, because it meant the conflict was no longer about two women competing for the same place. They were being placed within two different chapters of the monarchy's story. One represented the future. The other represented a past that refused to disappear. And Diana represented the memory connecting them both. For William, this was the outcome he had been working toward. He did not need a public victory. He did not need Camilla removed from royal life. He needed the institution to acknowledge something he had believed for years. His mother belonged there. The visible consequences began to extend beyond the portrait itself. Diana's legacy could be discussed more openly. Her charitable work could be referenced without treating it as an uncomfortable subject. Her influence on the modern monarchy could be acknowledged as part of the institution's history. And with every such reference, the same underlying message became harder to ignore. Diana had not disappeared. She had simply been waiting to be remembered on the institution's own terms. For Camilla, however, this created a deeply personal dilemma. She could accept the portrait and allow the past to remain part of the present. Or she could fight against it and risk making Diana's memory even more powerful. There was no easy choice. And then came the moment that made the entire situation even more painful. Camilla turned toward the one person she expected would understand her position immediately. Her husband. King Charles had spent years building a life with her. He knew what she had endured. He knew the criticism. He knew the hostility. He knew how difficult it had been to establish her place beside him. So Camilla waited for him to intervene. But Charles did not. He remained silent. And that silence told her something she had not expected to hear. William's decision was going to stand. But before the story could truly end, there was one conversation left. And unlike the institutional process, this meeting would be deeply personal. William would finally have to face Camilla herself. The conversation between William and Camilla was never going to be about a portrait alone. By the time they finally faced each other, the institutional decision had already been made. The portrait was staying. There was nothing left to negotiate. And that made the meeting more difficult, not less. Camilla knew William had spent years carrying unresolved feelings about his mother's death and everything that had surrounded it. William knew Camilla had spent years trying to build a place for herself within a family where Diana's memory remained extraordinarily powerful. Neither of them could change what had already happened, so there was no point pretending they could. William did not enter the conversation looking for an apology. He did not accuse her of destroying his mother's life. He did not demand that she step away from the monarchy. Instead, he returned to the same principle that had guided his decision from the beginning. Diana deserved to be remembered. That was all. But sometimes the simplest statement carries the greatest weight. Camilla understood what William was saying. The portrait was not an attack on her position. It was not an attempt to erase the life she had built with Charles. It was a refusal to allow the existence of that life to erase Diana from the institution's memory. That distinction left both of them with very little to argue about. Camilla could explain her own experience. She could speak about the hostility she had endured, the years of public judgment, and the difficulty of entering a royal family where almost every decision she made was inevitably compared with the woman who came before her. William could understand all of that without accepting the idea that his mother's legacy should become smaller because of it, and that was the emotional boundary between them. He could acknowledge Camilla's present without surrendering Diana's past. There was no dramatic reconciliation. There was no sudden embrace. There was no moment when decades of complicated history simply disappeared. Instead, there was something much quieter: recognition. William understood that Camilla was never going to experience Diana's memory in the same way he did. And Camilla understood that William was never going to separate his mother's memory from the way he viewed the family that remained after her death. For years, the public had often imagined the relationship between them as a simple conflict, but the reality was far more complicated. William did not need Camilla to disappear. He needed the monarchy to stop behaving as though remembering Diana required permission. That was the real change. And Princess Anne understood it. She had helped William reach the institutional moment, but she did not interfere with the personal conversation. She allowed them to face each other without an audience, without reporters, without advisors, without anyone turning their words into another royal spectacle. The portrait had already answered the institutional question. Now, the two people most directly connected to its meaning had to confront the emotional one. Could William remember Diana without allowing anger to control the rest of his life? Could Camilla accept Diana's permanent place in royal memory without seeing it as a threat to her own? Neither question had an easy answer. But William appeared to understand something his younger self could never have known. Honoring his mother did not require him to remain trapped in the moment he lost her. It required him to carry her memory forward. And once that private conversation ended, the story moved beyond William and Camilla. Because what had happened inside Windsor could no longer remain entirely private. The palace had made its decision. The family had felt its impact. Now Britain was about to see it too. The story could no longer remain behind palace walls. Once Diana's portrait became visible again, the meaning of the decision began to spread far beyond Windsor. At first, the reaction was cautious. Royal commentators examined the significance of the placement. Newspapers revisited Diana's relationship with the monarchy. Television programs replayed familiar images of the princess, while asking a question that had never completely disappeared. Why did Diana still matter so much? The answer was not simply nostalgia. For an entire generation, Diana had represented a different kind of monarchy. She had transformed the relationship between the royal family and the public by making people feel that someone inside the institution genuinely understood them. Her influence had survived her death. Her charitable work had survived. Her sons had survived. And now, decades later, her image had returned to the heart of the institution itself. That was what made the decision so powerful. It suggested that Diana was no longer being remembered only as the woman whose marriage to Charles had collapsed. She was being remembered as a major figure in the history of the modern monarchy. For some commentators, that was long overdue. For others, it raised uncomfortable questions. Was William simply honoring his mother? Or was he deliberately reshaping the royal family's relationship with Diana's legacy? The distinction mattered because William was not just Diana's son anymore. He was the future of the institution. Every decision he made carried a different weight from the decisions of an ordinary family member. And that made the portrait impossible to separate from the future monarchy. Public reaction became increasingly emotional. People who had grown up watching Diana remembered where they had been when they first saw her, what they admired about her, and how deeply her death had affected them. Younger generations who had never met her encountered her through photographs, documentaries, family stories, and the memories of their parents. The portrait became another part of that inheritance. It allowed people to look at Diana not simply as a tragic figure from the past, but as someone whose influence continued to shape the royal family. And then the conversation became more complicated. Camilla's position inevitably entered the discussion. Some saw the restoration as a symbolic victory for Diana. Others argued that the monarchy should be mature enough to remember its past without turning every historical figure into a winner or loser. That disagreement was exactly what made the story so compelling. Because William had never publicly declared that this was about defeating Camilla, he had not needed to. The symbolism spoke for itself. Diana was present. Her memory had been acknowledged. and nobody had to be removed for that to happen. That was perhaps the most sophisticated part of the decision. William had not rewritten history by pretending the difficult years never happened. He had allowed the difficult history to exist alongside the woman Diana had been before it. The public could make its own judgment. Some would see healing. Some would see unfinished resentment. Others would simply see a son finally giving his mother the recognition he believed she deserved. But beneath every interpretation was the same undeniable reality. A private decision inside Windsor had become part of Britain's public conversation, and now the country was watching the royal family for something even more revealing than a statement. They were watching their faces, because sometimes the most important royal messages are never spoken aloud. They appear in a glance, a pause, a distance between two people, and at the next public appearance, those small details would tell the story more clearly than any palace announcement ever could. The most revealing moment did not come through a palace statement. It came through an image. At the next public royal appearance, the family stood together as they had done countless times before. Cameras were everywhere, watching every movement, every expression, every brief exchange. But this time the public was looking differently. They were looking for signs. William appeared composed. There was no visible anger, no attempt to draw attention to himself, and no indication that he wanted the moment to become a personal spectacle. Princess Anne was equally controlled. She did not need to explain why she had supported William. Her presence beside him had already communicated enough. And then there was Camilla. She remained part of the royal family. Nothing about her formal position had suddenly disappeared. But something had changed. Diana was now part of the visual story again. That was the detail nobody could ignore. For decades, Diana had existed primarily through old photographs and memories. Her sons had grown older. The monarchy had changed. New generations had appeared. Yet her image still carried an extraordinary emotional force. Now that image had been brought back into an official royal setting. The symbolism was impossible to miss. William was no longer the teenage boy walking behind his mother's coffin. He was an adult royal with the authority to decide how his family's history would be represented. Anne was no longer simply Diana's sister-in-law. She had become part of the decision that restored Diana's visibility. Charles was no longer able to treat Diana as a chapter that belonged entirely to the past. And Camilla was standing inside an institution where Diana's memory had once again become visible. Nobody needed to say what that meant. The body language said, "Enough." A glance could last less than a second and still reveal discomfort. A pause could communicate more than a prepared statement. The distance between two people could become its own headline, and that is exactly why royal appearances can be so powerful. The monarchy depends heavily on symbolism. Where people stand, who walks beside whom, who speaks first, who waits, who looks toward whom. These details may appear insignificant to someone watching casually, but to an institution built around ceremony, they can carry enormous meaning. The image also revealed something important about William. He had not won by destroying anyone. Camilla remained. Charles remained. The monarchy remained. What had changed was the place Diana occupied within the story. She was no longer simply the woman who had once been married to the king. She was no longer merely the mother of the future king. She had become part of the monarchy's permanent historical memory, and that was the victory William had actually been seeking. Not the humiliation of Camilla, not the reversal of history, not revenge for its own sake. Recognition. For years, William had carried a private understanding of his mother that the public could never fully share. Now he had found a way to make part of that understanding visible. The most striking part was that Diana did not need to be physically present. Her portrait was enough. Her name was enough. Her legacy was enough. She could occupy a room without speaking. She could influence a family without being alive to witness it. And she could remain part of the monarchy without taking anything away from the people who came after her. That was when the deeper meaning of the entire story finally became clear. William had not truly avenged Diana by removing Camilla. He had done something far more lasting. He had made Diana impossible to remove from the story. And once that happened, the question was no longer whether the past could be changed. It was whether the future monarchy would finally learn how to live with it. In the end, the story was never really about a portrait. It was about memory. William could not change the past. He could not return to the years when his parents' marriage was falling apart. He could not protect Diana from every painful moment that followed, and he could never undo the night that took his mother away. But he could decide what happened to her memory afterward. That was the significance of the portrait. It represented something that had been missing for years. A visible acknowledgement that Diana belonged to the history of the institution as much as she belonged to the memories of millions of people who had loved her. For William, that mattered because Diana was never simply a famous princess. She was his mother, the woman he remembered away from cameras, the person whose loss changed his childhood forever. And perhaps that is why he approached the issue so differently from the way many people might have expected. He did not try to erase Camilla. He did not demand that the monarchy forget the difficult years. He did not attempt to rewrite the history of his parents' marriage. Instead, he created space for another truth to exist beside it. Diana could be remembered without pretending the past had been simple. Camilla could remain part of the royal family without Diana disappearing from its history. Charles could continue his role while accepting that his first wife would always occupy a unique place in the story of his sons. And Princess Anne could stand beside William without turning the moment into a public family feud. That may ultimately be why Anne's involvement mattered so much. She represented continuity. William represented change. Diana represented memory. Together, they created a moment that was bigger than any individual disagreement. The monarchy has always depended on symbols, crowns, portrait, ceremonies, buildings, titles. The places where history is displayed can influence how that history is understood. By restoring Diana's presence, William was not claiming that she had been perfect. He was not asking Britain to forget the controversies surrounding her life. He was making a simpler argument. She mattered. Her influence mattered. Her relationship with the public mattered. And her place in the emotional history of the monarchy could not simply disappear because the institution had moved forward. For Camilla, the consequences were inevitably complicated. She did not lose her position. She did not vanish from royal life, but she had to accept something that perhaps no title could ever change. Diana would remain part of the story, not as a rival, not as a ghost haunting every royal decision, but as a permanent figure in the history of the family. That distinction is important, because revenge seeks to make another person suffer. William's decision, at its deepest level, was about refusing to let suffering become the final definition of his mother. The boy who once walked behind Diana's coffin could never bring her back, but the man he became could give her a place. And perhaps that is the most powerful form of remembrance available to someone who has lost a parent. Not changing what happened, not pretending the pain never existed, simply refusing to let the person you loved disappear from the story. Diana could not walk into Windsor herself. She could not see the portrait. She could not hear the conversations that followed, but her image could still stand there, quietly, permanently, looking out from the walls of the institution she had once represented. And William could finally look at it knowing that his mother was no longer waiting to be remembered. She was remembered. That was the real victory. Not that Camilla had lost, not that William had won, but that Diana's place in the story could no longer be quietly removed. William could never bring Diana home in the way he had once wanted as a boy, but he could make sure that, wherever the monarchy remembered its most important women, there would always be a place for his mother.